Good morning, everyone. Oh, that is really terrible. Good morning, everyone. I know I'm the first English speaker, but good morning. There we go. It's lovely to be here with you. My name is Dr. Dieter Veldsman. I'm from the Academy to Innovate HR. And really what I would like to do today is just to share 3 high-level thoughts with you. The first one, I'm going to talk about what are some of the mega trends that we are watching that we believe is going to change the HR professional in the years to come. Secondly, I'm going to talk about what does the reconstructed HR agenda look like? What are those things that's already influencing what we focus on and where we should spend our time as HR professionals? And then lastly, I want to talk about us as HR professionals. What does the future look like in terms of our own success profile? What do the skills look like that we need to start thinking about and that we need to develop for the future? Let me jump right in firstly around the mega trends that we are keeping an eye on as AIHR. The first one, we need to acknowledge that we've got an aging population. What does that mean? It means people want to work longer. Some people need to work a lot longer. Whilst on the other side, we also have a big youth unemployment challenge globally. Now, why am I talking about this at an HR conference? Because it's changing the nature of the workforce. It's changing the nature of the labor market. And we are going to have to solve for how do we create enough opportunities for new people to enter the workforce while still thinking about things like late-stage careers and as people shift beyond traditional retirement ages. Having said that, we then also need to make sure that we grow fast enough from an economic point of view that there's viable opportunities for us within the market. We are currently seeing that the market is lagging post-COVID. We see that the economy is sluggish, high levels of inflation. We need to make sure that we are able to shift that so that there's viable and sustainable opportunity for employment in future. That leads me to my third point that we are keeping an eye on, which is really around how consumers are behaving. All of us want everything now, immediately, in the way that we like it. And organizations have had to adapt through omni-channel approaches, new ways to go to market, and really to think about digital channels that is able to personalize what people want and why they buy from us as organizations. That leads us towards the fact that companies no longer can ignore their own sustainability agenda because consumers are holding them accountable for who they are and what they stand for and how they contribute towards the sustainability bigger picture. Moving forward, we have to acknowledge that there's still a global skills crisis. We estimate by 2030, there will be more than 2 million unfilled jobs in the US alone just because we don't have the right skill sets for people to be able to step into those roles and into those opportunities. As HR, this is a big challenge for us because we need to ask the question, where is the talent of the future going to come from? And what do we need today to make sure that our organizations have got access to the right talent pools? And then lastly, we can't ignore the fact that advances in technology, things like generative AI, and I know there's been a lot of talk about technology this morning already, is really fundamentally changing the way that we think about the human element within work, what that looks like, and how we will design our organizations for the future. Now, against this context, I want to really speak about what does that mean for us as HR? 3 things to think about. The first one is we're going to have to realign our priorities, and I'll unpack that in a moment. The second one, we're going to have to think about new ways to deliver value. There's a raging debate at the moment around HR operating models, our value propositions, and are we doing the right things for the right people within the organization? And then lastly, I want to ask the question, how do we shift HR to become a force for good? And how do we start owning on our own narrative with the opportunities that are on the horizon? So let's talk about priorities. So what is it and where should we focus? And I think the first thing I've already mentioned as part of our trends, HR or green HR is becoming a key priority where we have to help organizations shift towards how are they going to drive adaptive climate practices. What does that mean? It's really practical and it's really tangible. How do we help the organization think about business continuity when disasters happen? How do we help the organization think about how they balance productivity and profit as well as being a socially responsible citizen? And that's going to become a key conversation around sustainability. And we're already seeing a lot of chief HR officers starting to become HR and sustainability officers within organizations. The second one that we're going to focus on in terms of our priorities is tapping into the hidden workforce. I've spoken about the fact that even though people are working longer, new people are entering the market, we still have a big global skills shortage. And today we estimate that about 20% of the workforce can actually be classified as the hidden workforce. What does this mean? It means due to structural barriers, due to things in the past and in history, some people are not getting access to the right opportunities, and we're losing out as organizations on their critical skills. Here you can think about things like people returning from parental leave. We often find still a trend there that they enter into different positions than what they left. We find people here that's past the retirement age but still healthy and willing to work. What are we going to do with that workforce? As well as then neurodivergent employees. How are we as organizations accommodating our practices so that these people have viable and gainful employment? The benefit here is not only for the individual, the benefit here is also for the organization because we're unlocking skills that at the moment is underutilized within our society. That also leads me towards the fact that our focus and our priority around something that we call systemic diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. The last 12 to 18 months, there's been a big backlash, especially in the States, around DEIB practices. We've seen the culling of DEIB departments, high levels of layoffs. And the question we need to ask, is the work that we are doing as HR professionals in this space, is it really moving the dial and moving the needle around creating a more inclusive workforce and society? Now, we believe systemic DEIB, where we need to focus is making sure that we drive equitable practices for all in organizations. We raise the voice and we listen to the voice of minorities within the organization. And lastly, that we take targeted action that's no longer only about diversity washing practices, but about real, sustainable, long-term change. And the last point I want to make here is around resolving the productivity paradox for us as we move forward. The last 20 years, we've become smarter, we've seen technological advances, yet globally productivity has actually stagnated, and we see that across sectors and in different countries as well. If organizations are going to be successful, as HR, we need to help our workforce be productive whilst also being well. The challenge we find at the moment is that a lot of people think productivity is the opposite to well-being, and that's not true. These two things can coexist, but it's going to call for a very different approach from our side as HR professionals. The next thing I want to talk about is to achieve this and to combat these trends, we're going to have to really think about new ways to deliver value. And our first acknowledgement has to be around the fact that there's a new stakeholder landscape. What do I mean by this? All of us live in the HR world. We deal with a very complex and a very dynamic stakeholder environment. The bad news this morning, that's only going to increase. And we will see HR not only have stakeholders within the organization, but largely also between different organizations as we start to tackle challenges that can't be solved by one organization alone. We see HR in future, especially at a senior level, spending a lot more time in the external environment and bringing those insights in and aligning the organizational priorities to what industry wants to achieve. We can't do that with our current operating models. And we've been talking about this from years that we need to shift from silos to solutions. But practically, what does this mean? It means that we're going to have to think about deconstructing our HR operating models. Think about it as a puzzle. I take the puzzle, I take it apart, I take the individual pieces, and I put it back together to form a new picture. And why do I say that? Because we are not integrated and ingrained into the business in the way that we should be. We are still seen as a partner that sits outside as opposed to being core to business. What does this look like? It means that we will start rethinking things like centers of excellence that work in functional silos. It means we will restart thinking about setting HR teams up around key business value drivers and bringing multiple skills that is cross-disciplinary in nature together to start working together from a day-to-day point of view. The last point here I want to make is how do we then also shift so that HR can become a force for good? And I want to start here by mentioning the AI-empowered work economy going forward. A lot of talk already this morning around AI. It's one of the words I do understand that pops up. And what we can definitely see is as HR, we're going to have to lead this thrust around how do we integrate AI into the workforce and what is the role that AI is going to play. In future, if we look at some of the current studies and some of the initial findings, we are facing a world where potentially it will no longer be about high performers versus low performers, but it will be about people that are able to utilize AI as a companion in their work versus the people that don't. We're seeing big productivity gains already, but there's a real question here around ethics and how are we going to drive responsible adoption of AI to the benefit of all. We believe it is a massive opportunity for us as HR, not only in our own function, but also in the organizations, if we get this right. If we don't, there will be significant consequences that we are going to have to face that will have detrimental impacts for both people and the viability of organizations in future. The next thing we need to focus on here is then also around the shift towards work-life fit. Now, work-life fit is not work-life balance. Work-life balance implies that there's work and there's life, and I kind of need to tip the scale between the two in order to make sure that it's sustainable. Work-life fit means you as a human being have one life. In that life, work needs to fit into that. You've got certain preferences, you've got certain goals, certain ambitions. How are we going to provide new work arrangements that accommodates that for not only the human being, but for the way that the organization wants to work, so that it can access new and diverse talent pools and start driving a different type of employee engagement. Work-life fit is not about remote and hybrid work. It's about how do we incorporate autonomy and flexibility into the way that we design jobs. And then lastly, HR is going to become a lot more like a public relations function in future. Now, why do I say that? We're going to have to start controlling the narrative in the public domain around how we talk about the organization beyond only the employer brand. There are going to be decisions that we make, and we see it today already. If I implement a policy in an organization, tomorrow it's on social media because my employees don't like it or they comment on it. As HR, we're going to have to own that narrative to drive a new narrative pertaining to the role that HR plays in organizations that's no longer only about risk and compliance, but around driving prosperity and benefit for all stakeholders that sit around the table. What does this mean for us? So what does the future look like in terms of our own profile as an HR professional? And I want to touch on 4 things. The first one, what does our skill set look like? What are the new skills that we need to start thinking about? What mindset do we require? What is the tool set? And I'm going to end off with what is the heart set that we need to incorporate into what we do to make sure that we drive this change into the future and capitalize on the opportunities that it offers. Let's talk about skill set. And this is a model that we utilize at the Academy, where we believe that all HR professionals in future will become T-shaped. And what that means, we believe regardless of a role, or of level, or of industry, there's 5 core skills and competencies that all HR professionals need to master. First one is business acumen. We've known this for years, but it is really about interpreting what's happening in the world and aligning the HR agenda to make sure that we are able to address that for the organization. It's not only about understanding things like commercials and financials. It goes much deeper than that around making sense of what's happening in the external environment. Data literacy doesn't mean all of us need to be data scientists, but it does mean that we need to drive evidence-based practices. How do we drive fact-based HR? How do we tell a story through data that drives real movement and real action within organizations? Digital agility for us refers really to the fact that from a digital point of view, we need to be able to understand how do we use and scale what we provide as HR through technology. Think about the deskless worker, 80% of the workforce today, and most of them still don't have access to robust HR services unless they are on site because they are location bound. We need to change that, and digital agility is a skill set that will contribute towards getting us there. People advocacy, and that really refers to how do we build cultures in future that acknowledges people and drives human centricity and well-being, but also how do we drive change within the organization and create places where people want to work and want to stay. And that's something that we've been good at for years, but we need to up the game because the environment is starting to change. Execution excellence for us, that refers to how do we show up as HR professionals? What are some of the behaviors? How do we influence? How do we network? How do we build relationships? And how do we actually operate within the organization to navigate the dynamics that all organizations have? These 5 core competencies, they are complemented in the stem of the T by certain specialist competencies. Depending on your role, you might need skill sets in compensation and benefit, in organizational design, in talent acquisition, as well as then also something that we haven't really focused on in the past, which is around HR as a business leader. We're finding more and more HR professionals starting to have to lead their own teams, and we really need to instill those skill sets around how do we set goals and drive vision and inspire people towards what the future is going to look like. We will only get there if we change our mindset, and I believe the mindset of the HR professional in future is characterized by curiosity. We have to be curious about the world and what is happening, and we need to be open to experiment with new things that's going to improve the way that we show up as HR professionals in organizations. It means we have to become a lot more solution-focused, and I've spoken about that, breaking down some of our previous silos, but also be human-centered, but business-minded. It's a fine balance that we're going to have to walk in future around balancing these different and often conflicting priorities to make sure that we keep the human in mind, but realize that we are there to drive business impact and business outcome and business results. From a tool set, we know this, we've spoken about it this morning, we are going to have to operate in the phygital world, and that is a terrible, terrible word, but what it refers to, in the physical world, in the digital world, we're going to start seeing how we show up as HR across different realities, and how do we make sure that the experience of HR for employees in the organization is consistent, and that we've got the philosophy that pulls through all these different touch points. And then lastly, it is really about changing our heart set. And when I talk about heart set, it's about having the courage to say, how are we going to grasp the opportunities that are on the horizon? Because don't get me wrong this morning, the opportunities for HR in the next chapter of work is immense. There is so many opportunities for us to grasp, but we're going to have the courage to be able to step into that role and say, this is ours for the taking. We want to do something different. It means we're going to have to challenge the status quo, advocate for progression, for innovation, and above all, be backed by self-belief. I speak to thousands of HR professionals around the world in our organization, and the one thing is they still don't believe in their own skill set and in their own contribution, and we need to change that. If we don't believe in ourselves, business will never be able to see the value that we can bring beyond what we are currently doing today. Let me wrap up. I started talking just about 6 big themes, mega trends for us to keep an eye on, from population growth to changes in technology, as well as how do we solve for the global skills crisis. After that, I refer to the fact that we've got a changing HR agenda. And for us to reconstruct this, we're going to have to look at how do we become a force for good. We're going to have to look at new ways to deliver. And we're going to have to look at how do we drive new priorities such as productivity, systemic DEIB, in order for the benefit of both the human beings, the employee, and in the organization. I want to leave you with this thought, and it was a publication by Fast Company that came out in 2005 when they said, why we hate HR and why HR has got no future. Guess what? Same publication, earlier this year, 2023, spoke about the fact that why do more people want to work in HR now? The time for HR is today, and the future is rife with opportunity. But it's up to all of us sitting in this room today to grasp that opportunity. And my question to you is, are you up for the challenge? Thank you very much.